Welcome to the Revenue Rewired podcast, hosted by StringCan Interactive's visionary CEO, Jay Feitlinger, and no-nonsense COO, Sarah Shepard. We're here to accelerate your revenue and give your marketing purpose. All right, welcome everybody to this episode of the Revenue Rewired podcast. We're so happy you all are here. Hi, Jay.
Hey, Sarah, how are you? Welcome back to Phoenix.
It's so good to be back. I do love
Liar.
flying over Phoenix at night. It's so beautiful, especially at like sunset or when the sun is down and it's just lights everywhere. It's fun. I like it. Uh, today's topic is an interesting one because we've talked about, um, jokingly, I guess, in the past about ownership. And I don't know about like with your kids or even here in the office, there are some things where like, oh, I thought you were going to take care of that, or I thought you were going to take care of that. And many years ago, we read Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. And I don't know about you, but even though it's something everybody knows, uh, it just spoke about ownership in such a clear, concise way. And I think that's where a lot of companies have a missed opportunity. You know, we want to talk today about who owns revenue. Well, that's the problem. And I know you and I, over the last 10 years or so, have had this conversation at StringCan internally about who owns what item. And especially when you have a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of assumptions that go on. And I think, shared accountability is pretty dangerous and it can lead to a lot of gaps in revenue. And I know you have a pretty poignant story to share on just how critical this is. Um, you want to share that story because I think our listeners would really appreciate hearing that sometimes this simple solution is the best solution. And I know we're often, what do we call it, like analysis paralysisers,
Yep.
that it's really easy to do, I think, within our space because the more tactics you have going on, the more people you have, the bigger the team, you can get really lost really fast. But this was so eye-opening for us that this company seemed super button up and they just had just the leakiest pipeline and it was so sad. So maybe share that story with us.
Yeah, and I think I guess before I jump into that, the part that, and obviously you've heard me do this, is I flip-flop myself on this topic. And so I do want to be empathetic because it's so hard where every business that I've owned, I tell myself really everyone in the organization, and I know we talked about this in past shows, but everyone in the organization is basically part of sales. But I think there's a big difference between being involved and then also being held accountable. And I think that's really what I think we want to focus on today is that whole entire ownership accountability side. And so I think to your point on the story, and this has happened to us, so many different times. But one of the probably first questions I ask clients or prospective clients when we meet with them is basically, tell me, who owns, revenue at the organization. And I would say more often than not, I get the answer, oh, we all own that. And I think for me, I love part of that because it shows me that they are a revenue, focused, sales, oriented organization. But the minute I hear that, I know that there's going to be, concerns that they have around like, pipeline being stalled, all the handoff issues between marketing and sales to, operations, the leadership team being frustrated by, when they have their, pipeline, postmortems and things are going wrong. And so I think, when that happens and ties into the story is that when we had a client, I think they did about maybe 80 or $85 million a year in revenue. Overall, they actually had a pretty decent demand generation process, but they weren't closing deals. And so when we were hired by that organization or prior to being hired, the CEO who we were talking with felt like it was, really a lead generation issue. But then when I asked their head of sales, what his perspective was, and he's like, oh, well, our entire team is just, chasing bad lead quality or bad fits. And then when I spoke with the CMO, she's like, yeah, I don't think sales is right. These leads actually are freaking solid. And so when we really dove into it and did kind of a really deep dive analysis after we were hired by that client, what we basically found is the biggest issue they had was no one was really held accountable. And that was an interesting discussion for us because the CEO, the head of sales, and the CMO, they wanted to hire us to basically improve lead generation. But what we found is before we wanted to, start out, new tactics or adjusting what they had in place, we had to have that hard conversation about who's really held accountable. Now, the really good news in that situation with that client was the head of sales um, was able, willing, and excited about the idea of him being held, responsible and accountable. And so that's what I think, really comes down to it is that, if your organization, if everyone's saying they own the revenue, but you don't really have a named individual person at each stage of that, you're just basically like praying and spraying, spraying and praying that you're going to close some deals. And that's really not how, I think business growth works. And that's really kind of, I think, ties into what we're going to really talk about today.
Yeah, and you talked about the word accountability. That is so huge because I think in a way it's maybe slightly different than ownership, similar but different. And there's a myth of ownership and accountability in certain areas, and a lack of clarity in those particular pieces of the business is what really messes people up, and it sends them down these like rabbit holes of data, which I love it. I love how marketing can provide so much data that you can iterate and build on and come up with some really creative ideas and hyper personalization and all of that. But on the simplest level, we've talked about using the flow map to help uncover bottlenecks, but I think then there's a layer on top of the flow map, which is the accountability. And that's what I like about systems like EOS, because in EOS, they do an accountability chart, not an org chart. It's who's accountable to this role, to this position, to this outcome. And it gives a sense of clarity. And even us as a team, a leadership team, we look at that quarterly. And it's often interesting to me the perspectives of the variances in accountability. And truly successful people, if they're being seen as not accountable to a certain area, I think chances are it's not because they don't care. And that's where, like when you mentioned, I wanted everyone to own revenue, they do care, but it's like, how am I being held accountable to that? What's my metric of measurement? What am I ultimately, looking for a desired outcome in what area, KPI, et cetera? And if that isn't clear, saying everyone owns something means no one owns it and no one's accountable to it. Um, and it
Yeah,
just is like the biggest, it's the fastest way to chaos.
it really is. And, again, what I love about what we do is we definitely eat our own dog food. And I think for me, that's where I honestly learn a ton because, again, I think about it, and I love that you use the EOS as an example where we've had so many quarterly meetings. And I'm sure, and you probably remember this more than me, but I'm sure I also was, a troublemaker here. But, there's been so many times in our own company where we would have some kind of quarterly rock that we were going to be focusing in on. And we would have, more than one person raise their hand and saying that they want to be the owner of it. And, I recall probably 10 plus years ago, there was at least one quarter where I'm like, okay, that makes sense to me. Let's go for it. And that it was a complete disaster to your point about the chaos part. And so you kind of like need to have like a one neck to choke type mindset. And again, I'm not trying to be from a negative perspective here, but again, to your point, like shared responsibility is really the fastest path to complete chaos. And I love that word chaos that you mentioned a few minutes ago. And so that's really what I think needs to be, a really important part is that if your organization, if you're listening to this, isn't using a business operating system like EOS, I would recommend at least to read some of the books around it and start applying some of that to your business because I'm not saying it's probably half the problem, but a significant part of the challenge that we've seen during our strategic process with our new clients and helping them with their quarterly annual goals is we often find that, accountability, ownership side is a big part of the problem. And if no one clearly understands not only the person, but also their team members don't understand who's responsible for every aspect of the pipeline, from, marketing to sales and operations, that's that's going to really cause some significant fuzzy leadership. And that's really what I think needs to be addressed is making sure that you're all agreeing on who the owner is and why.
Yeah, and I think, going on to our second part, a lot of organizations are working really hard to solve this problem. And this role that we're going to talk about isn't new, but the CRO, the Chief Revenue Officer role, is not new to this industry or any industry really. It's just getting more and more popular. I think because businesses are becoming more complex, they're trying to do more. Their customers are asking for more. They're basically requiring more. And so we keep having to like level each other up, and that's what's exciting, and that's what businesses like ours love is competition, and it drives innovation, and that's all great. But the cost of that confusion, I think, is also what's helping drive these decisions to create an ownership structure. um, and I know you talked about that one organization, and do you remember how much it was that they were struggling with, in their pipeline? Like, there's some crazy stats about, one missed lead is it just disintegrates your pipeline, depending on how much you've got in there. But it also exponentially can grow, creating an even bigger revenue gap, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, that client, when we had a meeting, what I think was helpful with that one client, we had individual chats with each of their leadership members. And I'll never forget where the CMO, to your question a minute ago, shared with me that they had a really solid lead from her perspective come in. um, there was a weird issue in their process that the lead wasn't followed up within probably a couple days. Now, I know a lot of companies are like, that's not a big deal. I'm gonna follow up in 2 or 3 days on a lead, but often the first company that's going to get back to that potential new client or customer is often going to have a better chance of winning the opportunity. And so in that situation, the sales person assigned that lead and that client reached out, I think, about 3 days after the lead came in. And that lead responded back and saying, I really need to move forward. And we got back a proposal from one of your competitors yesterday, and we're moving forward with them. You lost this opportunity. Um, the CMO was pretty brave, and she actually called that person just to get some feedback. And it turned into it was about a 2.2 or $2.3 million missed opportunity that they definitely would have won. And that caused a lot of weird tension internally in their organization. And so, again, I use that example often where there's so many aspects to this around, we can get tactical around the CRM and the process and handoff things and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, in that situation, again, there wasn't an owner. And that's why, when you brought up the CRO, the Chief Revenue Officer, I know a lot of our clients don't have that role in place. But those that do, that have like it's called like a head of sales and marketing, or VP of sales and marketing. What I have found personally is that if you do have one person at your organization that's, again, capable and willing uh, to be that role, because they have the oversight over both sales and marketing, it does inherently really improve some of that ownership slash accountability side. because now you do have that one neck to choke who that person is responsible for improving the culture between the marketing and sales departments and really figuring out, where you have that gap because I have found that confused ownership, it definitely does impact, the P&L statements. And so that's where I think the C-suites, when we talk about it from that point of view, like the missed opportunities, it does encourage them to want to really have the hard conversation. I know that this stuff is often hard, depending upon internal politics and seniority and all that stuff that we have to often deal with. But once you get through some of that tough stuff and you allow people to take ownership over the part of the organization that makes sense for their skill set, it really does help create a lot better alignment. And then the conversation really ends up being about often we have found that our clients don't need new leads. They just need someone accountable, taking ownership over converting the ones you've already had. And so just doing the finger pointing thing of sales blaming marketing and marketing blaming sales and whatever the reasons might be, I just think it wastes so much unnecessary energy. And that's why I think when we decided many years ago to have us be, a solution to help addressing that marketing and sales alignment issues, the conversations we're now having with our clients are just so much more exciting. And I just love that we are showing such significant value in making all their lives easier, but most importantly, impacting the bottom line of their, P&L statements.
Hmm. Well, and there's a couple of operational things in there too. Like the visual that kept coming to my mind, especially with organizations that have a dual sales and marketing ownership role. And it's like, have you ever, well, you probably haven't, but I'm sure you've seen Rachel or the girls pick out a necklace from a jewelry box and it's just a mess. It's just a
Yep.
glob of stuff. Okay.
I've done
But
that many times, untying those
ultimately
stupid
it's a
little
circle.
chains.
Yeah, and they're like, I need help. uh, and it's like for me, I see that as sales and marketing dual role where they have two ends. Nobody just grabs the wad and starts pulling. You try to find an end and make your way systematically through the whole process to unravel, and you've got your beautiful loop, right? Well, that's what sales and marketing is it's a nice loop system. However, if you can't find one end and pull it through the other end, you're going to end up spending a lot of wasted time. So the cost isn't just in bleeding pipeline and drop deals, it's also in the time spent trying to uncover what the actual problem is. And so, by having clear ownership and accountability structures, and I know I'm using the word sort of similar. And I think it's all about how you as an organization present those words to others. So we use both. Like extreme ownership is you really take it on and it's yours. But accountability, I think, is a whole nother level, especially in the C-suite. And so you could lose a lot of internal time and energy and efficiency by having your leaders try to unravel where the problem actually is. But when you have clear accountability structures, you can more clearly identify who it is that you need to go to get the right answers. And the other piece is, I think it also frustrates internal team members too when they're caught in the crossfire of these kinds of
Hmm.
situations. It doesn't feel very good because when you don't know what kind of impact you can have when everything is chaotic and it doesn't feel like there's a solution or that ownership cares enough to figure it out or to create a clear structure, it really isn't something that people want to add to their plate every day. It's like, you know what? This is just not what I need. My job is hard enough as it is. And I think moving into really having the discipline to create those accountabilities and not let overlap happen, that's another just operational nightmare. And I think then that adds to the confusion, it adds to the problems. And then before you know it, you're down this rabbit hole and you have no idea what even got you here in the first place. Because as you and I both know, once you start unraveling something, something else inevitably pops up and it's like squirrel, but
Yeah.
you're really trying to fix one issue.
Yeah, I mean, I loved the analogy used around the necklace thing because I mean, there's been dozens of times that I've been responsible with that, and you are right. Like, I'll never forget. my oldest daughter Lexi when, she had a really nice chain, and it was very thin and it was all bundled up in a little ball. And she wanted me to fix it. And as I'm doing it, she started pulling at it and she made it worse. And obviously she was little. She was probably like, I don't know, like 8 years old. So she didn't understand that. But I think when you just were talking, immediately my mindset turned into the whole like a ladder concept, and I think that's a really good analogy or like the ownership ladder because if you're smart, there is an element of the person climbing up the ladder, and there's hopefully someone holding the ladder. And so I think, I think we need to make sure it's clear that we do want there to be this team element where you have team members involved, but almost like each, step of the ladder, I think you need to think about that from an accountability perspective because as we all know, the journey or the flow that it takes from a stranger, from a customer point of view, to become actually a paying customer and then to stay with you. There's a lot of different stages of that process, and it's not this, perfect step one, step two, step three, like a ladder goes. You do jump around a little bit, more like a circular fashion. But I think from a process perspective, you do want to make sure that it's very clear that you do have a single point of accountability at every single stage of the way. And then you're working together as a team to be passing data and knowledge back and forth. And then, end of the day, if you realize that there's a breakdown in that ladder, instead of again pointing fingers and blaming someone that you didn't, hold the ladder properly, instead just have the conversation. That's the part that I think is super exciting. Is that if you don't, assign it, I wouldn't recommend expecting that it's going to get done. And that's the part when our clients, when that light bulb goes off, and this process, and this, I guess, concept is not at all rocket science. It's pretty simple. It significantly involves just human nature. And again, unless you're the owner of the business and you're an employee, there is this fear about losing your job, no matter how comfortable someone is in their role. And so I think that that makes people naturally want to kind of cover their butt. And I think if you could, the sooner you can build up trust that someone has your back and they're holding that ladder, and they really do want to have feedback, and if the problem that they uncovered in that flow audit is tied to their step of the stage, then just having that conversation and learn from it and move on. Versus again pointing fingers and doing the stupid blame game.
Which is such a also a waste of energy, you know. And I think too, I'm reflecting a little bit about our history and some of the experiences we've had. And one of the things that I think really helped us and other clients that we've advised is you also need people that you can count on. So it's not just you, CEO, to a team. You do need, I think, some layer of management and support to help hold that accountability because, we talked about this in a past episode with bringing me on as the COO, second in command integrator, and how hard that was. Like adding layers of leadership can be very challenging, but it also, again, doesn't put all of the accountability on one person, which feels like a lot. And it's really hard to get things moving and get momentum in the right direction when they're already spread so thin. They're like, I don't know how to solve this problem, you know?
Yeah, actually, it's funny as you were just talking about that. I had a little bit of not PTSD, but I was
Somehow I knew
thinking,
you were going to say that.
but I was just thinking about the past. And again, here I know that I don't always practice what I preach, and there's been numerous situations, less this year, but more in the past. Where my background personally is very diverse, and I get super excited about doing numerous aspects of the company. And again, I know that wasn't this wasn't the goal of this show, but I think there is that second in command type of team mindset is that often people don't realize when they're allowing themselves to be the root of the problem. And so the one downside of a role where you're overseeing both sales and marketing is that end of the day, you're gonna likely have affinity to one area or the other that you enjoy more. And I've been a bad person around that sometimes because sales can be hard, especially when there's things that are out of your control with like the economy or when COVID happened and whatnot. And so often you'll just make yourself busy on doing other things like marketing. And I remember a few years ago when we were talking about doing some really fun projects here to help not only grow our agency, but also help grow a couple of our clients into some new service areas, especially like AI. Um, I'll never forget when you pushed back on me when I said I wanted to be the owner of that project. And so I do think that it's really good to have everyone have a voice and sharing their vision around where they think that the evolution of the company should go. But it doesn't always maybe make sense to have a person that's excited about it doing it because it might actually distract them from doing what they should be doing. And I definitely greatly appreciate when you push back on me where I didn't realize that me agreeing to a thing that I thought would take me 5 minutes, you luckily knew better that it would take me more like 5 months. And then all of a sudden, what would happen is you might have agreed to let me do that. And then 5 months would go by, and I'd be like, oh, well, I didn't get those other three things done because of this big thing. End of the day, it's like, who now is at fault? And I think we have to obviously share some of that. But I think, again, sometimes there are some strong personalities in the leadership team and I do think that, over the last probably 5 plus years, Sarah, you have found your voice and have done a really good job with me and other team members where you keep us in our lane. I know you always use the terminology around like the bumpers in bowling, which I personally never have used. I'm a great bowler. I'm just kidding. Um, but I think that's also a side little value that I think that, again, this whole benefit of working as a team. And yes, one person needs to be responsible and accountable at every step. But I think that person needs to have open ears to others in the team and that might share some concerns if that person's taking on either too much responsibility or doing things because it might be fun and it gets them away from being, blamed when the pipeline is not achieving the goals that the company agreed to.
Yeah, it's like I just made up this acronym, but it's accountability should be realistic and measurable, So the arm of the organization or the arm of the role is that and it's funny, I think that's why we work really well with sales leaders is because they typically enjoy working in sales and they know marketing feeds the machine, but it's really hard to be accountable to both. I mean, it's crazy. Even I watched a video yesterday of you presenting a decade ago, and the
Oh
data
God.
that you were presenting on was so different than today. It just reminded me of how exponentially fast this industry has grown, and to keep up with it is so much work. And I think it's overwhelming to a lot of sales teams and sales leaders. And that's why they enjoy working with a marketing agency because they don't have to be experts in both and they have a super clear accountability structure.
I love
And
that.
so, yeah, I think, this is probably a good place to wrap this one up where if we had probably one piece of advice, it would, in my opinion, be for a leader to take an accountability audit. Take the flow map to the next level and go through and make sure that you don't have confusion because side note, I had a chat with one of our clients about AI rolling out through their multi-location facilities, and it was so much confusion on who was supposed to quote own AI. And I thought, oh my gosh, like that alone is going to create so much conflict in the future and chaos. And don't assume that accountability is understood by everyone. I don't think it hurts to revisit it, to clarify it, because we're all growing and innovating, and the speed of work and the pace is just incredible. I think it's an awesome opportunity to do a quick little accountability audit and see where you have some opportunities to really shore things up and clarify, because that's going to be the fastest way to unpack some of those bottlenecks and those big revenue gaps.
I love that. Yeah, I think to your point, you are right. It's like again, I guess step one is doing that audit, but I think once that is done and you have the strategy completed from the tactical side, I think that the launch of this is not really about doing more effort. I think to your point, it's about having clearer ownership, because you can't really fix what no one's owning. And so when we've worked with our clients during that kind of like flow audit or accountability audit type of phase, and we started naming an individual single person to every step of it, we have noticed how much faster that pipeline is moving in a positive direction. And so I think that's really kind of a one final note that I wanted to share is that I know this is a lot of work, and there is some sensitivity that I've noticed that goes into it, with certain roles or certain personalities. But once you get through some of this kind of tougher, radical candor type conversations, we've seen every single time that the opportunities that they uncover is just so much more positive, and it's worth all the extra effort to go through this process. And I think also to your point, one other final note is that the speed of change is inevitable. It's never going to stop. It's probably just going to get faster and faster. But if you don't have this foundational stuff solid, I couldn't even imagine having to not only solve improving your foundation, but then also having to then implement some of this. It's almost like building a house on concrete that isn't set yet.
Mm,
It's just going to fall over. And so I love that you brought up the idea of like that first step is really all about that kind of accountability, ownership type of matrix audit discussion. Because if you improve that foundation and make it super solid, what you could build on top of that is so freaking exciting.
yeah, I love it. Awesome. Well, thanks, Jay. This was a fantastic episode. We hope you all enjoyed it and looking forward to seeing you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone. Nice seeing you all.
Thanks for tuning in to the Revenue Rewired podcast. Send us your questions to podcast@stringcaninteractive.com and follow us for more insights to drive your business forward.